Alright, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another video on close reading. You have already watched a video on close reading, but the close reading questions are less straightforward than the sourcing questions. This video is going to give you some strategies for answering the close reading questions and some tips for how to use those questions to move from summary to analysis. The first question asks, what claims does an author make? Well, what is a claim and how can we find them? A claim or an argument is an assertion that an author makes. An author might have multiple claims through their piece of writing, but it's really helpful to figure out what the underlying argument is for the whole source, their topic sentence or thesis statement. A claim might be true or not, which is why it's helpful to use the word claim. We're figuring out what an author says before we decide whether or not to believe it. And a claim can be explicit, clearly stated in an author's writing, or implied, suggested, but not directly stated. And most sources are going to have both. So now that we know what a claim is, let's take a look at an example and do some practice. Here's our example. This is an advertisement from the 1950s. It makes some explicit and some implicit claims. What do you think those claims are? Take a minute to read and look closely at the advertisement. Try to identify the overall argument the advertisement is making, and maybe one explicit and one implicit claim, something the author directly says and something they suggest. The image is in OneNote, so you can zoom in and notice the small details. Here's what I noticed when I was looking for claims. I think the overall argument of this advertisement is, you should buy our vacuum. No surprises there. And then they have lots and lots of other claims throughout the rest of the ad. The ad features a woman using the vacuum. Maybe the advertising is making the implied argument that women are responsible for housework. At the same time, the ad writes that you can purchase this vacuum from your friendly Electrolux man. Maybe they're suggesting that men are responsible for jobs and participating in business. Okay, now I've summarized, I've identified some of the claims that the author is making. To move on to analysis, I need to think about why an author would include these claims. Their overall argument makes sense based on the perspective of the author and the type of source. This is the Electrolux company making an advertisement. They would want customers to buy their vacuum. Everything in the advertisement is crafted to make that argument. I would have to dig deeper into the sourcing or the context to explain why the author included those strict gender roles about women cleaning and men working in the ad. But now that I've identified those claims, I know what questions to ask next to try to get to analysis. Alright, so now I've got a handle on claims. Let's take a look at our next close reading question. The next close reading question is, what evidence does the author use? This question pairs nicely with the question about claims. It's easier to identify what evidence is important after you know what argument the author is trying to make in the first place. Let's look at our vacuum example again. I've already figured out that this author's main argument is, you should buy our vacuum. What evidence does the advertiser use to try to back up that argument? Try to identify 2 to 3 pieces of evidence the advertisement gives to convince you to buy the vacuum. There are lots and lots of potential pieces of evidence you could have pulled from this advertisement. Here's some of the things I noticed. The advertisement says that it's the world's lightest, most heavy-duty, easy-to-use vacuum. They try to make the vacuum sound cheap to purchase by saying it's only $70, $50. Down at the very bottom, the advertisement mentions that the company Electrolux is America's, quote, largest selling cleaner. Now that I've summarized some of the evidence, it's time to move from summary to analysis. Now you have to evaluate and analyze that evidence. Based on the evidence the author provided, do you think they've proved their argument? One of the pieces of evidence that stand out to me is the advertisement statement that the vacuum is, quote, heavy duty. You can't really prove that adjective. Does that mean it'll last a year? The advertiser probably included it because it's not something you can prove, but it sounds great. The author also chose to include that they are the, quote, largest selling cleaner company. They probably included that to give them credibility in a more concrete way. Lots of people have bought our product. That means you can trust us. I've identified my evidence, and by explaining why an author would have included that evidence in the first place, I'm moving from summary to analysis. So that's claims and evidence. Let's take a look at our next close reading question. What language does the author use? Again, this question is all about thinking about choices. There are lots of words an author could choose to make their point. Why did they choose these particular words? Let's take a look at a different source for this close reading question. This is an excerpt from a book about the fall of the Qin dynasty, a government that ruled China in the 2nd century BCE. It was written by a man named Jia Yi, who was a government official for the Han dynasty. After the Qin dynasty fell, it was replaced by the Han dynasty. Take a minute to read this excerpt from The Faults of the Qin by Jia Yi. There's also a copy in OneNote, so you can zoom in and read through the text more closely. As you're reading, think about what language choices or phrases stand out to you. Don't try to interpret anything yet. Just look for phrases you think are important. Or in a few words, how would you describe the tone of Jia Yi's piece of writing? There's a lot of potentially important phrases that you could pull out of this piece, but here are some of the things that I noticed. Jia Yi uses a lot of insulting adjectives. He describes Chen Shi, the man who led the army that overthrew the Qin, as, quote, mediocre, and his army as shuffling and a disorganized crowd. But even though this was a sad, pathetic army, the whole world came to them and joined. But don't forget, Jia Yi still says, they were a, quote, laughingstock. Jia Yi is mocking and even a little sarcastic. Not usually what I would associate with the language choices of government officials. So now I've summarized and pulled out some important language choices. The next step is analysis. That means asking why. Why would Jia Yi have described Chen Shen's army this way? I think he could have gotten the point across without repeating over and over again how pathetic the army was. To move from summary to analysis, I'm going to use the final close reading question to help me get there. Here's our next question. How does the document's language indicate the author's perspective? This is a question that asks you to jump straight to analysis by using sourcing information. In other words, what's the author's perspective? How did it influence what they chose to write? Why is the author making these language choices? Let's try to do that here. We know that Jia Yi was a Chinese poet and government official during the Han Dynasty. He lived from approximately 200 to 168 BCE. The Qin Dynasty ruled China from 221 to 206 BCE, and after the Qin Dynasty fell, it was replaced by the Han Dynasty. That's our sourcing information. We've also read an excerpt from The Faults of the Qin. We learned that Jia Yi wasn't very complimentary towards the army that overthrew the Qin. So take a moment and try to put those two things together. What is his perspective? Based on Jia Yi's perspective, why do you think he was so insulting towards the army that overthrew the Qin? So there are a couple of things that could explain why Jia Yi is so insulting towards the army that overthrew the Qin dynasty, but here's my theory. I think it's really important that Jia Yi is a government official for the Han dynasty. The Han dynasty took over after the Qin dynasty. Jia Yi might be trying to make the Qin dynasty look bad, and by default, the Han dynasty looks better. The Qin dynasty was such a weak, pitiful government. They could be overthrown by a sad, disorganized, pathetic army. And I've got even more textual evidence to back up my theory. Jia Yi also insults the leader in the Qin dynasty at the end of this passage, saying he lacked humaneness and rightness. So Jia Yi's perspective as a government official for the Han dynasty could explain why he's including all of this very forceful language that ends up being insulting towards not just the army that overthrew the Qin dynasty, but the Qin dynasty itself. Putting all of this together is going to take some practice, But that's exactly what we're going to keep doing during the close reading unit. Here are some takeaways for you guys about using these close reading questions. First of all, you probably won't go through all 4 close reading questions for every single source. Try out 1 or 2 questions and see which one helps you identify something that you think is significant. Then after you've identified something you think is important that needs explaining, then try to explain it. Keep asking why an author made that choice to get to analysis after you identify an author's claims or evidence or language choices. Authors make choices. Close reading helps you identify the choices that authors make, and historians explain why authors made these choices in the first place.